At the Delaware Art Museum right now, there's an exhibit of father-son painters from Wilmington, Edward Loper Sr. and Edward Loper Jr. Edward Loper Sr. was born and raised on the east side of downtown Wilmington, and he had a big following in his lifetime and taught painting for nearly 70 years before his death in 2011. And the innovation that Edward Loper Sr. brought to painting was this ability to use color in his paintings that you don't necessarily see in the object that he's painting, but when you see that color in the painting, it somehow all makes sense. In videos that are part of that exhibit, Edward Loper Sr. is shown telling a student, you want to make sure that you're not painting the objects, but that you're painting the colors. Most people, he says, are so busy painting the objects that they don't see the painting. So it's kind of like, the best I can tell, I'm not a painter, but it seems like it's about backing up and seeing something bigger than the thing itself. And he says that once you learn to see as an artist, then the world will never look the same to you again. And so to paint in that Ed Loper style is not to copy the lines that you see or copy the shapes that you see. It isn't even about the colors. It's about all the colors that you cannot see, but which are somehow there. And so to paint in the Ed Loper style is to occupy a disposition of curiosity about what is happening there. I wonder what colors are in this person's face that I cannot see, but are somehow there. I wonder what green looks like in a spring sky. I wonder what is possible. And to paint in this Ed Loper style is also, it also requires a certain amount of risk. The risk to paint what you can't fully comprehend, what you cannot fully predict, and you can't control. And to paint in this Ed Loper style also requires a kind of intimacy, the willingness to go deep into the heart and soul of a subject beyond just tracing the outline before you. This past week together, we have occupied these places of curiosity, of risk, of intimacy. In preparation for your congregational meeting and vote today, we have spent the last 8 days together in one-on-one conversations, in large format question and answer sessions, informal meet and greets, potlucks, committee meetings, staff meetings. It's been a full week. And during this time together, I got to hear what excites you about what you've been doing, what's happening here, what is starting to happen here. I got to hear what challenges you imagine for the future, what challenges you experience now. And you've had lots of opportunities to ask me questions along the way, too. And I've been very interested in this topic of questions. Over the last few weeks, I've been reading a book called The Book of Beautiful Questions. It's by an author by the name of Warren Berger. And you might be surprised to know that this book is actually written for corporate America. It's written for business leaders, CEOs, entrepreneurs. And what he talks about is how we have a tendency to ask questions of one another and of ourselves that are very limiting. We ask questions that actually lead to preventing innovation, preventing creativity and productivity. And so he wants us to ask beautiful questions instead. And we can apply this idea to social situations. And I'm thinking right now of a time in our congregational life that many different churches across the country of different denominations experience each week. We call it coffee hour. And during coffee hour, this time after the service, when we're chatting over a cup of coffee or tea, we tend to ask each other very uninspiring questions like, hey, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. What do you think of the weather? Oh, it's fine. What do you think of the weather? Oh, it's fine. You know. I wonder how those conversations might sound if we asked more beautiful questions. Like, what's the strangest, most interesting thing about where you grew up? What did you want to be when you were growing up? What's the single weirdest thing that's ever happened to you? I dare you to lead with that today. What are you excited about in your life right now? What problem do you wish you could solve? Warren Berger says that beautiful questions are open questions that invite exploration and invite wondering. Beautiful questions invite us to tap into what matters in our lives. He says that beautiful questions never result in a simple yes, no, or one-word answer. And sometimes beautiful questions are hard to answer. We might even be afraid of the answers. Beautiful questions, whether they come with an answer or not, also have the power to transform us. A common question that you all asked me a lot over the last week was about my own personal theology. What do I believe? And mostly I responded by talking about how I believe in some kind of higher power, but not a higher power who intervenes in our daily lives. Like, I don't believe in a higher power who intervenes to make a particular team win the Super Bowl, although that might have happened in 2018. And I certainly don't believe in a higher power that swings an election. But for a long time, I stopped using this word God to refer to this higher power. But more recently, I've turned to that word God, even though I find that word insufficient for how I understand what is holy and sacred in this world. I also believe in the power of healing and in the importance of hope in our lives. And so throughout this week, that was my answer, more or less, as I addressed that question from time to time. And I kept coming back to that question and wondering whether it was a beautiful question. Did it inspire exploration and wonder in me? And I realized that the beautiful question is not what do you believe, but why do you believe that? When I asked myself the why do I believe in a higher power? I recalled my deepest moments of despair, of grief, and I remembered how in those moments I somehow always felt held. And why do I believe in a force greater than me? I think part of it is because I've had the honor to sit with different people after a terminal diagnosis and watch them manifest something of emotional and spiritual healing so that they could die with gratitude and peace. When I sit with the why of my beliefs, I can begin to recall certain faces of people who went from deep pain to unimaginable joy. Why do I believe in wonder, in miracles? This past week, Barry Mars and I got to talking about butterflies and evolution. And we shared a belief in something of the miracle and wonder of creation, how a caterpillar is somehow formed and somehow turns into a butterfly. And all of the parts of the process that have to line up for that to happen. And the more I understand the science of that transformation, the more wondrous and impossible the whole thing seems. Not that I believe a force is intervening to make that happen, just that there's some mystery and some power in all of that that is beyond imagination. Part of my theology that most mystifies people is how I can hold on to hope, even in a world that sometimes seems to be spiraling downward. I often look outside myself for that hope. I saw some of that this past week as different members of this congregation got excited and animated as they told me about independent living for young adults, ILIA, a program of this church which acknowledges that some youth go through painful, debilitating setbacks in foster care, and that when they age out of foster care, they are expected to very suddenly pull it all together and get a home and a job and enter the adult world of self-sufficiency, which others of us got all kinds of support throughout our lives. So many of you work so hard to make sure that young adults can make that transformation into adulthood well. And despite how hard it is still for youth aging out of foster care, hearing those stories this week gave me hope for our wider community. And ILIA was born out of people asking beautiful questions. Questions like, why are some young adults thriving and others are struggling? And if we cannot change the foster care system, how can we build a network to address the challenges faced by youth in that system? And how can we model something of nurture and love for youth who might have missed out on those primary experiences of bonding? Why? What if, and how? These are the questions which are sometimes hardest to stay in, but that have the power to lead us to these transformational places. In Warren Berger's book of Beautiful Questions, he says that we didn't actually start out afraid of these questions. We started out loving these questions. He says that at about 4 years old, we ask the most questions that we ask in our lifetime. In fact, there are studies around this that say that a 4-year-old girl is a peak questioning machine. Girls more than boys, I don't know why. But 4-year-old girl asks up to 300 questions a day. I'm sure if you've been a parent of a 4-year-old girl, you are not surprised, but it's a lot of questions. And then as children move through school, they're often discouraged from asking questions. They're discouraged from asking questions, especially that are complicated or lead to exploration. Teachers, parents, other adults don't have the time or the energy for one more why question. We just want to get things done, so we jump quickly to those solutions. Also, adults and peers of children model this idea that we're all supposed to know everything we need to know already. And so we learn that in order to sound smart, don't ask any questions. We might even feel shame when we don't already know something. By our teen years, most of us have stopped asking beautiful questions altogether. And what Berger is trying to do is re-inspire that intellectual curiosity, that intellectual humility. He invites us into a state of openness to new ideas, a willingness to be receptive to new sources of evidence, and a comfort in sometimes being wrong. And it's catching on. A Google executive publicly announced that the one quality that the company looks for when hiring is intellectual curiosity. I have a nephew named Christian. He's 17 years old now. And I remember the day that I felt like he passed me intellectually. He was 4 years old. He took apart a pretty complicated alarm clock, and then he put it all back together again, and it continued working. And even today, he still has that insatiable curiosity for how things work. He also has a willingness to be wrong sometimes. Sometimes I think if I could wish for one thing, I take away that shame impulse that seems to follow when we are wrong or don't know something about someone. Berger suggests that when we are wrong, instead of feeling shame, that we should feel a pleasant surprise of discovery. To say, oh, okay, my long-held belief about this was wrong. Huh, interesting. What if we were willing to be seen as naive? What if we were open to admitting that we are sometimes wrong? Another question that came up a few times this past week was about how we can heal the polarizations of our country. Talk about a big question. I wonder how conversations across political aisles would sound if both sides occupied a sense of intellectual humility and intellectual curiosity. This past week, another question I heard a lot was about how to grow our church membership. Religious institutions all across the country are asking this question of themselves as church membership across different denominations continues to decline over recent decades. Unitarian Universalism is one of the few groups who has not experienced a sharp decline in recent decades. But we have reached a kind of plateau which feels uncomfortable for some. Meanwhile, in our secular lives, there's an increasing need for spirituality, for connection, for social activism, and these are three areas that churches have historically held. So instead of asking, how do we grow our church? Over this past week, we started moving toward the more beautiful questions that we could be asking ourselves. What if the Sufi poet Hafez is right and everyone is just waiting for a meaningful connection, to be welcomed and seen and loved? What if we could cultivate that kind of welcome here for every single person who comes here? And what are the spiritual needs and the justice needs of people in our congregation and in the wider community, and how do we respond to those needs? What is possible? What is impossible but exciting to think about? Questions like these are countercultural in a time when our wider society often wants, we just want to sound smart. We just want to change somebody's mind or argue just for the sake of arguing. This is a time when people are pushing their agenda without trying to understand how their agenda might be hurting someone else. A time when our elected government leaders are sometimes more interested in power or money or self-interest than they are in building connections or promoting well-being. I'd like to share with you the question that I heard most this past week from you. This is the question that many of you asked me over and over again. How can we support you and your future ministry here? I heard this question from Glenn. I heard this question from Peggy Doss, from Marilyn Height, from Kathy Thomas, from staff members, from members of the Board of Trustees. And right now I don't have an answer for that question, but I am deeply touched by that particular question. I wrote it down so that I could keep thinking about it. And because so many of you modeled such connection and intimacy with me, I'm going to share with you the one question that I was thinking throughout our time this past week. It is the question that Reverend Keith Cron from the Unitarian Universalist Association Transitions Office says is the question that a minister is asking oneself all throughout pre-candidating and candidating week. The question that I have silently been asking myself in every encounter with you this past week: can I love you? You have taken my breath away with your stories, with your kindness, with your passion for our community, for justice. And all week long, every day, I'd come home exhausted. I am naturally an introvert, I'll tell you. I came home exhausted at the end of a day, and my husband Eric would look at me and he'd say, "You look so happy. You have made it easy to love you. I feel personally transformed by our time together. I am inspired by hearing some of your perspective of this congregation and the world. This past week of holding big and beautiful questions together has energized me and given me so much hope for the future and filled me with so much love. I hope we get to do more of that for a long, long time.